Would you please welcome Professor Tracy Shildrick and Professor Rob MacDonald.
Right, we're going to be talking about three generations without work, myth or reality. I'd first of all like to thank the organisers, Peter Kelly and colleagues at the Poverty Alliance, for inviting us here. It's a great honour to be in Glasgow speaking about the research, part of which was conducted in Glasgow with Tracy and others. Over many years we've been researching with and about poverty and deprivation, usually in a place called Teesside, which is many people in England don't know where Teesside is, so it's a deindustrialised conurbation in the northeast of England. But with our most recent study, which I'm going to be sharing today, we've also conducted research in Glasgow, so it's great to be here, and I did want to be here to do this. Thanks to Joseph Rowntree Foundation as well for funding this study, and most of all to the participants in it for talking to us. I want to start with some quotations. Doxa, that's a posh word. Orthodoxy or common sense orthodoxy. There was this opening comment about some of this stuff being cross-party. So here's one from Tony Blair. Behind the statistics lie households where three generations have never had a job. Ian Duncan Smith. Now here he's talking about a place nearby where we are today. On some estates, often three generations of the same family have never worked. These aren't just ideas that we might discuss in a classroom or in a lecture hall or in a seminar, but ideas which feed directly into policy. So the Universal Credit document contains this statement: we aim to reintroduce the culture of work in households where it may have been absent for generations. Tracy spotted this one on Newsnight. Chris Grayling, who at the time was a Minister for Work and Pension, said, there are 4 generations of families where no one has ever had a job. Close to home in the northeast of England, there's an organisation called Tyne Gateway which talks of 5 generations of unemployment. I haven't had anybody beat me on that one yet, but you hear. Now, I think the point is, these are respectable, serious people, making clear statements without caveats and ifs and buts about 3 generations or 4 or 5 generations of families where no one has ever had a job. So the first question for our study is a very simple one. Are there 3 generations of families where no one has ever worked? Is that true? If it is true, how widespread a problem might that be? Second question, put that one to one side. Do cultures of worklessness, values, practices, attitudes, aspirations, ways of life, passed down through generations, through families, encouraging younger people to prefer to be unemployed, to prefer not to look for work, to choose unemployment as a lifestyle choice, to there was a program you would be too wise to have missed, to have avoided. You're wise enough to have avoided this last night. Channel 5, proud to be on the dole, I think it was last night. What extent is there of welfare dependency in cultures of worklessness in the UK? So 2 quite simple questions. Now, for reasons of space, I'm going quite quickly, and I want to talk to you first of all about method. Hands up, who thinks there is a thing called the Yeti? Great. What's your name? Say it again. Caroline, right. So Caroline thinks there's a Yeti. Great. Thank you, Caroline. She might be right. Look, there's a picture of one at the top. That I got that off the internet. So there's some evidence. How do we prove to Caroline that Yetis don't exist? Really difficult. Really, really difficult to prove to somebody that a thing doesn't exist. Yeah? Proving a negative. Caroline might respond, well, you didn't look hard enough. You looked in the wrong mountain range. You asked the wrong questions. You didn't use the right sort of tracking devices. So in hunting for 3 generations of families who've never worked, in hunting the Yeti, we devised the sort of case study approach which gave the best chance possible to finding the sort of thing that politicians describe and talk about. So it was a critical case study approach. We selected purposefully some of the most deprived neighbourhoods of Middlesbrough and Glasgow, neighbourhoods with relatively stable populations and high rates of joblessness. We used methods which meant that we were in those places doing community-based field work for about 8 months, using all sorts of anything we could think of to try to find families where 3 generations had never worked. Knocking on doors, putting posters up, hanging around, going to jumble sales, coffee shops, speaking to anybody. Do you know anybody who might fit the bill? One particular strategy we used is this last one, the last bullet point. In earlier research, in earlier studies we'd done, this idea that there are families where nobody's ever worked has been a very popular one, said back to us by people whose opinions we'd respect, by people who work in neighbourhoods with people who are suffering disadvantages of different sorts. So we talked to GPs, youth workers, community workers, counsellors, priests, anybody we could think of in these 2 particular neighbourhoods. As I said, there's this idea of 3 generations of families who've never worked. Can you help us? We need to speak to them. The first answer was yes, or my first question was, what about this idea? The first answer was, yeah, there are loads of them, or I know that story, or yes, that's true, or there are lots of those sorts around here. So the idea was very popular with practitioners who worked in the communities that we were researching. Those practitioners, though, when pushed to, can you help us meet some of those families, couldn't help us. They couldn't think of any when pushed. What normally would happen, they'd say, you mean never worked? I'd say, yeah, never worked. What I mean, well, Uncle Billy had a job, or she had a job, or he had I mean, there's been lots of unemployment, or there's lots of unemployment over time in those families, and there's all sorts of other troubles going on. But actually, no, if I'm trying to think of a family where nobody's had a job over 3 generations, actually I can't think of any.
Can I just jump in there? Because that's a really important point, and I think it picks up on the question earlier, that once you start to kind of chip away at that idea, and if practitioners then think, oh, well, okay, it's not actually something about individuals that we need to change to actually solve the problem of worklessness, that presents you with a much more difficult challenge. So I think for us, this is a really significant finding from the research, and hopefully we'll pick it up again in the discussions.
So first study question was, are there 3 generations of families where no one has ever worked? Our answer to it is, we couldn't find any. It was impossible to locate any such families using the methods we used in the neighbourhoods that we looked at. Now, as it happened, amongst the families that we spoke to, many in the older generation, like a grandparent generation, were now deceased. Not altogether surprising when you think about health inequalities and how they're concentrated in poor neighbourhoods. But we could learn about those grandparents' work histories from the parents, if you like. You see what? And what they described was, for the grandparents, working lives full of jobs. And if you think about Teesside as a place, or Middlesbrough at the centre of Teesside, in 1965 it had full employment. It was a place which was booming, where just about everybody had jobs. It was a successful, prosperous place that worked. So the idea that you'd be 3 generations of families where nobody's ever had a job is sort of a bit implausible. So at the same time as we were doing this study, other researchers, Gaffney and Macmillan in particular, did analysis of the labour force survey, the sort of best available social statistics that can be got on this question. And their analysis came to this conclusion, that in terms of workless household, less than half of 1% of all workless households in the UK might have 2 generations where no one has ever worked. So less than half of 1% of all workless households in the UK might have 2 generations where no one has ever worked. So obviously, if you're thinking 3 generations, the figure's going to be even smaller than that. It's infinitesimally small and a possibility that there might be 3 generations where no one's ever had a job. Ian Duncan Smith was one of the people I quoted at the start. He's Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Minister for Work and Pensions, well known around here in Glasgow. he is a keen champion of this idea. There was a Freedom of Information request issued to him and his department in March this year to ask him, what's the evidence for this thing that you keep saying? And he quote, statistical information on the number of UK families that never work is not available. And his statements were based on, quote, personal observations. All right, so the 3 generations idea, I think we just put that to one side for the moment, but that still allows the possibility that even forget that idea, there might be this thing about cultures of worklessness, about people unemployed over time generating values and attitudes in their families which encourage people to be unemployed. But eventually, and I won't go through all the details, this is the nature of the group that we spoke to. 20 families, 10 in Middlesbrough, 10 in Glasgow, 47 people in total. A parent in the middle generation who was long-term workless, at least 5 years, and that household having in it, that family having in it, at least one young person of working age who was unemployed, probably who'd never had a job. So we spoke to 20 families that looked a bit like that, to test this idea of cultures of worklessness. And the method we used was sitting with people, talking in depth. Interviews usually lasted some hours. I think the longest one was 4.5 hours, person to person, interviewing usually the different generations separately. And I think at that point I pass to you.
Thank you. For reasons of space here, in this particular presentation, we're going to concentrate on people's attitudes and values towards work, and particularly the relationship between the generations. When we talk after the break, we're going to talk more about the complexity of the families' lives, of the families that we interviewed, and certainly the stories that we heard, and I did a good number of the interviews, and they were really long, hard, harrowing interviews. So a few words about values and attitudes across the generations. Well, perhaps the key finding across all of our research over many years has been that people actually want to work and have very positive attitudes towards employment. Surprise, surprise. In this particular study, we were talking to a different group, a particularly disadvantaged population, but again, we found really positive attitudes towards wanting jobs. And people didn't at all value being on welfare. So there's a couple of examples there. Vera, very, very typical. It's important for self-esteem, for everything, just how you are. So people are really quite astute about the benefits of working, and they're often not financial ones. And the same there with Jade. Take anything. So these are really very common findings. We talked to people about their job searching because we were well aware that people might give us the sorts of answers they would expect that we might want to hear, or that would be that they might tell us they were looking for jobs or they wanted jobs, but they didn't that didn't necessarily translate into practice. There was a difference between the generations, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But there was no sense in which people really valued being on benefits, and I'm sure I don't need to explain to this room that being on benefits, being on welfare is really very, very hard. So we were talking to people who were often in very deep poverty, even if they might deny that themselves, and that's a whole other issue. So people described very well the sorts of hardships that they faced. I think one of our most important and perhaps most interesting findings in respect of the discussion around intergenerational transmission of poverty, transmission of attitudes, is that the older generation were really, really keen for their younger generation to have different lives to what the parents had had. And the same with the young people. They really wanted their lives to be different to their parents. And I think that is a really crucial finding. Kenny here, he's talking about his children who are actually in employment, but a real sense of wanting children to do better. Now, we'll talk later about the lack of economic and social capital that often our families had to be able to do very much to help their children into jobs, but they often were taking steps that they felt they could. So we had one of the mothers who was encouraging her children to go on a paper round. She was doing that with them, you know, helping young people to go to job interviews. So real sense in the interviews of lives wanting to be different. And I think a crucial question here today will be around how we think about the causes of how things might transpire in the same way over generations and how things might be transmitted. And the question for us was whether that was about attitudes and values, and we concluded that it wasn't. Just to give you one concrete example, this is a little bit of an extract from an interview that was undertaken, unusually in this case, with we tended to interview people separately because, as you can imagine, talking to people within families presented all sorts of ethical and complex issues around how people might talk about their relationships with their parents and their children. But in this instance, we interviewed the family together. And Claire, the mother, and Douglas, this was a very, very complex family situation. The mid-generation had dependent heroin use and all sorts of complex difficulties, and there was a lot of really serious ill health within the family. But Leanne, the daughter, talks about here how she doesn't want to just sit around. And Claire, the mother, says, end up like us. And Douglas, the uncle, says, vegetating. And she says, aye. More or less, Claire's kind of repeating the question that we were asking. She's asking you, did I bring you up to think it would be okay to be on benefits? Did you grow up thinking, no, I'm going to be on benefits like my mum? Leanne says, no, I know I've not worked, but I'm not stupid. And she goes on to talk about how she really wants to work. And I think this is an important kind of extract in terms of, and it's very common across the interviews. There was a difference between the two generations, and we'll talk more about it in the next talk. But I think what's very striking, perhaps most importantly for our conversations here today, because this intergenerational cultures of worklessness idea is often really directed towards young people, that young people are inheriting anti-work attitudes. Well, the young people in our study, perhaps surprisingly, given the nature of their backgrounds, given the nature of the complexity of the problems and difficulties that they had faced in their childhoods, they had very normal and conventional aspirations. We traditionally do research around young people and young people's transitions, and all of the research which looks at young people's aspirations for the future will tell you that young people want to have very traditional things, the sorts of things that you and I might want for our futures if we were asked when we were younger. So they want to have a job, they want to be able to be independent, perhaps have enough money to be able to have a holiday. So lo and behold, these young people had very similar aspirations. So here Charlotte talks about wanting to live somewhere quiet. And again, this was a really common theme, that the neighbourhoods where people lived were often very risky ones. It meant that they were often subjected to particular sorts of risks and difficulties. So an aspiration to be somewhere quiet, to bring up children just somewhere quiet. And again, aspirations for wanting children's lives to be different to how their own might be. This quotation from Mark McGinn is really quite interesting because he talks about these normal, straightforward, simple aspirations, wanting to be able to have a job and have a family. But he also talks about how he's kind of losing hope and he's not sure if that's going to happen. And in this interview, it was very interesting. You could almost see this is a young person who's on a kind of cusp of going in one direction or the other. And I think there's some really important questions there about interventions and what might happen in terms of families. So how do we explain the position of our young people? Well, to put it mildly, they had a very bad start. Their childhoods were very disadvantaged, very chaotic. But very, perhaps, a little surprisingly, their story is perhaps a straightforward one. We've had some debate within our project meetings, But if these neighbourhoods were ones where there was an abundance of work, I'm fairly confident that most of the young people we interviewed would be in jobs. That's not to say they'd be in jobs that lasted, and we'll come to that shortly. But these young people are at the back of a very long queue for jobs. They're at the back of a very long queue for jobs which are probably not very good jobs, short-term, low paid. So I think we can explain their positions relatively simply. Now we come to the zombies. Rob likes to talk about zombies, so I'll let him butt in on this slide.
Yetis, zombies. Summary, conclusions. 3 generations where no one had ever worked. Well, if it exists, it's a minuscule problem. I think we sort of know that now. So if you hear people say that, I think you say, go to this report, it's probably largely not true. More important question, evidence of cultures of worklessness in these families. Well, we couldn't really find any. In terms of the values, practices, aspirations that people had, we couldn't find evidence that a culture of worklessness, as has been described over the centuries, over the decades, under different names, could explain the situations of these families. And for me, if you push me, well, what is the thing most of all that would convince you of that? Is the unanimity of the view expressed by parents. Now, this is quite an unusual thing for parents to be saying. Parents saying, I don't want my kids to end up like me. And the unanimity of the kids, of the young people, the young adults say, I don't want to end up like my parents. They all said that. Now that doesn't speak to me of a sort of culture of benefit dependency and worklessness passing down the generations. Zombies. Right. Paul Spicker, Professor of Social Policy, uses the idea of zombie theories. This is the idea that in every generation, and certainly over decades, a new name gets invented for what we're talking about. Cycles of poverty, cycles of cultures of poverty, cycles of deprivation, underclass theory. 3 generations have never worked. Going back even further to the residuum, the social scum, etc. And then in every decade or any generation, some keen, smart aleck researchers roll up and say it's not true. Like we've just done with this. So so these are, if you like, zombie theories, he says. They're immune to evidence. They work at the level of ideology rather than facts and evidence. Now, that leads us to a question, I think. Well, what do? Do you just ignore them? We're now into the politics of some of this. Do you just ignore these ideas and hope they'll go away? But I spoke to my son, who plays PS3, about zombies, and he says, well, you can actually kill them. If you blast them in the head, you can kill a zombie, you know. So I suppose that's what we're trying to do here. Some ammo for doing that. And the other thing, and I think this sort of relates to some of the conversation that we're having about, well, what do we do about this, or we might agree with the critique, but I think certainly in terms of this cultures of worklessness idea, we need to define what the problem is first, before we then start, well, what are we doing about it and how best to act and what interventions we should have. When you do research for the Joseph Brownfield Foundation, they insist at the end of your report you've got to write down these policy recommendations, and for us sort of focus on what should you do about all this? Overthrow capitalism, okay, that'll do. But that doesn't wash. So we had all sorts of things, and then we just thought, well, we got an agreement. Well, it's very simple. Politicians and policymakers should stop talking about cultures of worklessness because it isn't true. That's not the problem. In another study published at about the same time, different study, Poverty and Insecurity, available in all good bookshops, we did research on what's called the low-pay, no-pay cycle. What that means is people churning between low-paid, insecure, low-quality jobs and time unemployed, and then back into a job and back into In the neighbourhood in Glasgow we research, and in the neighbourhood in Teesside we research, we could have spoken to hundreds of people who were tied up in the low pay, no pay cycle. That was the common experience of worklessness and welfare. It's not the story you hear about in the papers or when the Daily Mail attacks scroungers and skivers and so forth. So I think we need to define the real problem first before we think about what solutions or what policies we might be thinking about. So churning between unemployment, and just one example. So at the time of writing this slide, I think 6 months ago, there were 1.6 million people on JSA at the time, but 4.8 million people have claimed JSA at least once in the previous 2 years. That's an important stat. It shows the churning around in unemployment. So we think that the predominant experience is one about poverty and social insecurity in and out of work, and we need to be addressing that rather than myths, if you like, about cultures of worklessness. Thank you very much.